So where we left off the last time, we were talking about Ronald Reagan, and in particular, we were talking about his domestic policies. Keep in mind that Ronald Reagan was riding this rising tide of conservatism nationally into the White House in 1980. And one of the things that he campaigned on, and one of the things that he attempted to do very early on in his presidency, was to reduce the size of government, slash spending at the same time. What we're going to talk about today is his foreign policy, which, as you'll find out, his beefing up, if you will, of the government really complicates his ability to kind of do some of the things that he had promised to do in 1979 and 1980. But in any case, what I want to begin is Ronald Reagan and his understanding of the Cold War. Unlike Richard Nixon, and certainly unlike Jimmy Carter before him, Ronald Reagan really abandoned the policies of détente. If you recall, we were talking about détente in the context of Richard Nixon, who had reached out to our adversaries, both the Chinese and the Soviets, and not only created a dialogue, but in a lot of ways agreed to reduce the size of our nuclear arsenals. It was a way of making the world a safer place to be, if you will. Ronald Reagan is not going to go down that road. As a matter of fact, Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire and vowed to throw it on the ash heap of history. Okay? Now, much like Jack Kennedy, Reagan inherited a situation as president where radicalism had come to his backyard, and it's going to capture his undivided attention very early on in his presidency. Now, for a second, I want you to think all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. Remember the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? We were talking about that in the context of Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy. The Roosevelt corollary more or less said that the United States could do whatever we wanted to do, whenever we wanted to do it within the Caribbean basin, and we did it over and over and over again in places like Haiti, places like Cuba, places like Nicaragua. And that's what I want to talk about here for the next few minutes. What happens in Nicaragua is the American government basically sets up a government that's very warm to a lot of its policies, a lot of its economic interests, and they call this government the Somoza government. It's the Somoza government that's not exactly the most Nicaraguan friendly. I mean, I'm talking from a citizen's perspective anyway. It's the Somoza government that gives rise to a resistance movement led by a guy named Augusto Cesar Sandino. And it's going to be Sandino that will bear the name of the overall resistance movement that in 1979 topples the Somoza government. This resistance movement called themselves the Sandinistas, Sandinista government. Well, it's in 1979 that the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza government, and more importantly, they implemented a socialistic regime. And so very similar to Kennedy with Castro in Cuba, you've got the Sandinistas in a Central American country that have implemented what the United States considers to be a very radical regime. And this is going to capture the attention of the Reagan administration very similarly to how Castro captured the attention of the Kennedy administration. But for the time being, I want to move to the opposite side of the world. You have to understand that the people that are in Congress, congressmen and senators, they have Vietnam very fresh in their memories. The mistakes that we made, the trap that we basically got ourselves bogged down into. And so that they were determined not to go down that road again. To that end, Congress passes a new law called the Boland Amendment, which more or less just clarifies things that in order to take the country into war, and in order to engage any kind of act like that, the president would have to go through the proper channels. He would have to get an actual declaration from the Congress. This was not going to be a 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution with Lyndon Johnson, where Congress more or less just wrote him a big blank check, and he was able to do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted to. Okay? And so what I need you to understand about the Boland Amendment is this is really going to limit President Reagan's ability to just kind of do whatever he wants as far as places like Nicaragua are concerned. Maybe he wants to go in there and he doesn't necessarily want to call it a war, but in order to do anything like that, he's going to have Congress's approval. Okay? Now, on the opposite side of the world, in the Middle East, radical, some might even call them a terrorist group known as Hamas, had taken American prisoners. And Ronald Reagan was all too familiar with what the hostage crisis in 1979 in Iran did to the Carter administration. He was determined not to allow that to happen to his presidency. And so what Ronald Reagan's administration does is they reach out to the main ally of the Hamas organization in the region, and that would be Iran. What they're hoping to do is to get Iran's cooperation and put pressure on Hamas to free the American hostages. But unfortunately, like anything else in life, you don't get something for nothing. And what the Iranian government wants to know is what's in this for us. And so what the American government said what was in it for you was American weapon systems. We will sell you the most sophisticated weapon systems on the planet if you put pressure on your ally to free the American hostages. Now, I want to make two things clear. Number one, we're selling them these weapons. We're not giving them away. We're selling them. Okay? And number two, there's nothing illegal about this. We can do business with whomever we please throughout the world. That's not the issue. It doesn't exactly look good. It's not really all that public relations friendly, but it's not illegal. So we sell the weapon systems to the Iranians. The Iranians fall in line and they help us free those American hostages. That's the good side. The downside is what we use that Iranian money. Keep in mind, they paid us. We didn't give it to them. We used that Iranian money to train a group in Nicaragua that called themselves the Contras. Now, the Contras, for your notes, was the oppositional group of the Sandinistas. Do you see where I'm going with this? We're hoping that the Contras can overthrow the Sandinistas government and we won't have to go into Nicaragua, let alone declare war. Well, the only problem with this is taking that money and having the CIA train the Contras, equip the Contras, is essentially a violation of the Boland Amendment. And automatically, people want to know what's going on, who knew what, and who commissioned what and where. Through the testimony of Colonel Oliver North, and if you're following along with me on the slide entitled Iran-Contra Affair, you can see him giving testimony before a Senate committee. In any case, what Colonel North essentially did was implicate higher-ups in both the Pentagon and in the White House, and ultimately the buck stopped with Ronald Reagan. Now, keep in mind, Reagan was a very popular president in 1986 when all of this is breaking. And the press asked him, Mr. President, did you commission this? Did you give the green light? And to that, Ronald Reagan said, I don't remember. Now, Reagan was a relatively old man when he was inaugurated president. He was the oldest man to be inaugurated at age 69. And we were still in the honeymoon stage of his presidency. I mean, for the most part, we still had a very likable, amicable relationship with the president. So, for the most part, the press is going to give him a pass, or excuse me, a pass on this. But what comes to be known as Iran-Contra affair is going to be a stain on the Reagan presidency. It's going to be a scandal. Essentially, what I'd like you to understand about the Iran-Contra affair is that it was a sale of arms for hostages, and it was also the money that we got from those weapon sales to be used to train the Contras. It was a scandal in the sense that Watergate was a scandal. It was a scandal in the sense that the Tet Offensive was a scandal. It was a scandal in which the American people once again came full circle that you really can't trust what the government tells you or what the government says it's doing. In a lot of cases, it's doing things that are not exactly on the up and up. In this case, an outright violation of a policy that had been on the books, and the government's not trustworthy. Okay. Now, back to Reagan's foreign policy as it related to the Cold War. Reagan pursues a two-pronged strategy of attack when it comes to dealing with the Soviet Union. Whereas presidents like Dwight Eisenhower and Jack Kennedy had tried to match the Soviet strength for strength, what Ronald Reagan does is he tries to hit the Soviets where they're weakest. And where they are weakest is in their economy. Now, of that, Ronald Reagan really begins to beef up the military. Now, part of what he's doing when it comes to building nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers and, F-15s and things of that sort was what he had promised to do on the campaign trail in 1979, really ramp up military spending to, make America's military mean something in the world again. Now, that was not the only reason that Ronald Reagan felt that it was important to retool America's military, because he understood that the Soviet Union was essentially in an arms race with us. And every time that we built an aircraft carrier, they were going to have to build one. If we built a nuclear submarine, then they were going to have to build one. Now, this is going to cost us a lot of money, of course, but the American economy is just head and shoulders above and beyond that of the Soviet economy. And so where I'm going with this is that Reagan understood that we could afford to go into debt like that because our economy was so much stronger and so much larger than theirs. They were not in such an advantageous position. It's been said that Ronald Reagan spent the Soviets into their own graves. He spent them into their own demises, in the sense that he immersed them in an arms race that they just couldn't afford to be in. Now, the second prong of that strategy is that this is going to put a lot of pressure on the Soviet government. When you build military products, think about a country like North Korea, when you've got a large army and they've got a big arsenal, that means that you can't spend that money on your civilian population, and the civilian population of the Soviet Union in the late 70s, early 1980s is really beginning to suffer. Keep in mind, it was the Soviet Union that had invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and you had the Americans that were aiding the resistance that was doing things to the Soviet Union very similar to what the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army was doing to the Americans in a conflict in Vietnam. It was bogging them down there and forcing the Soviet Union to spend billions and billions of dollars every year on this war, at the same time that they now have to keep up with the Americans when it comes to this arms race. And so, in short, what Ronald Reagan is understanding is break their economy, you'll break the will of the Soviet citizenry, and you can really eat away at the Soviet Union. Now, I want to talk about the flip side of this for a second, because this is very significant. Yes, we can afford to go into debt much more than the Soviets can, but understand that this is going to have a long-term impact. Maybe not in the 1980s, maybe not even in the 1990s, but those problems, those are going to come home to roost one day. Ronald Reagan approved of a 20% across-the-board increase in military spending. Now keep in mind, at the same time that he's increasing the military's budget, he's decreasing our tax revenue by 10%, okay? So you've got the worst of both worlds if you want to look at it that way. Yeah, we're getting these great weapons, but we're spending 20% more, and at the same time we're taking in 10% less. And so the net of all of this is that this is really going to contribute to those massive deficit budgets that we were talking about the last time we met. I mean, nothing outside of the military budget and military spending is really going to contribute to this idea of growing deficits like the military's budget. As a matter of fact, at the height of military spending in the 1980s, it was estimated that the Pentagon was spending $34 million per hour. That's some serious cash, okay? One example that I'd like you to be mindful of before I go any further would be the Strategic Defense Initiative, what Reagan called SDI. Now Reagan came up with this idea that was what he considered to be a better option for a defensive strategy in the Cold War. Keep in mind, between the Soviet Union and the United States, there's enough nuclear weapons in the world to destroy it over and over again. And so what Reagan wanted to do was put a satellite in outer space and equip it with lasers. Reagan was an older gentleman, but he had heard of these things. My Dr. Evil impression for you. Lasers, right? So anyway, when you saw that nuclear missile coming across the Atlantic Ocean, one of these lasers was supposed to shoot it down, and it would fall harmlessly into the ocean. A good idea. The only problem is we're talking about the 1980s, and that kind of technology simply doesn't exist. And scientists and physicists told him, Mr. President, that kind of technology doesn't exist, but we dumped billions and billions of dollars into this research that scientists knew would ultimately not work in the 1980s, and SDI becomes a really good example of the military spending that we're talking about that contributes to these massive deficit budget, or deficits within our budget. There is some political fallout for all of this. In particular, there's this grassroots movement, this pushback against Reagan's military policies known as the Freeze movement. Now, what these individuals that call themselves the Freeze movement, what they want is they want Reagan to not only back away from military spending, but in particular, back away from the production of nuclear weapons. We don't only want to reach out to the Soviets and get them to do this too. We want to take the lead. We want to completely freeze, if you will, production of nuclear weapons in the United States. Now, Reagan's pretty quick to dismiss these people, calling them communist dupes or nervous Nellies, but ultimately there are some people that are beginning to ask questions with respect to all of this. But the upside of Reagan's strategy vis-a-vis the Cold War is that it ultimately broke the back of communism internationally. Okay? Keep in mind that in the 1940s, the late 1940s, what you began to see in Eastern and Central Europe are all these evil puppet communist governments that were really satellites of the Russian Communist Party. They're beginning to pop up in places like Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and they were inherently oppressive. I mean, look no further than East Germany to see the repressiveness of these Soviet policies during the Cold War era. And so in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was beginning to see its resources, especially its economic resources, increasingly depleted, what happens is a guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, says we need to talk about this. We really need fundamental reforms. Otherwise, this is going to be very problematic, and it's going to be unsustainable. So it's Gorbachev that introduces a policy known as perestroika. This essentially was Gorbachev's way of lighting a fire under the bureaucrats, trying to get them to realize that we have a decision to make, and we really need to think about fundamental ways of reforming both communism and our budget crises. Well, perestroika really didn't do very much when it comes to inspiring the Russian political leadership. And so, that being said, he introduced a new policy called Glasgow's Open Discussions. And basically what this amounted to was asking people like the Poles in Poland or the Czechs in Czechoslovakia, what do you think about communism? Do you want to continue with it? Do you want to be part of this? And ultimately they voted with their feet. They said, no, I don't want to. Now, think about what Joseph Stalin, what Nikita Khrushchev might have done when the Poles said, we don't want to be a part of you anymore. They would have gone in, they would have kicked butt and taken names, right? That's not what Gorbachev does. Gorbachev more or less just looks the other way. And in 1989, what you begin to see are these evil communist regimes in places like Poland, and especially in places like Eastern Germany, they begin to crumble. And the final domino falls in Berlin in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, for months leading up to this moment, Ronald Reagan, and to a lesser extent Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, had been calling for this on an international level. And it was Ronald Reagan that had gone to Western Germany and before the world, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, if you believe in reform, if you believe in liberalizing the communist sphere, then tear down this wall. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And in 1989, the wall ultimately came down. Okay, so it's not that much longer that communism in the Soviet Union itself. 1992, there's a coup, and the Communist Party is removed from power, and ultimately Russia goes back to being Russia. It's no longer the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is no more. So we won the Cold War. Cold War's over. I mean, this is a massive, massive deal, especially in a modern history class. I don't want you to think for a second that 40, 50 years is some drop in the bucket, because for the last 40 years or so, 4 decades, we've been immersed in this really, really scary standoff, this staring competition between us and the Soviet Union. And oh, by the way, it could end the world if something manages to go wrong. That being said, we emerge as the lone superpower in the world, but I don't want you to come to the conclusion that we don't have our hegemony challenged throughout other parts of the world. In particular, Ronald Reagan, like Jimmy Carter before him, really didn't have a great track record of success when it comes to producing lasting peace in the hotbed of international relations. That would be the Middle East, okay? In particular, in 1983, Ronald Reagan sent in the Marines to Lebanon, into Beirut in particular, to try to keep the peace. They weren't there to choose sides. They were just there to try to get the two sides to stop killing each other. Well, it's in Beirut that America got its first glimpse of the suicide bomber. You had a guy driving a dump truck that drove through the gate of the Marine barracks and blew himself and his truck up and killed hundreds of Marines in the process. And after that happened, Ronald Reagan said, look, if you're going to treat our peacekeepers like this, we're not sticking around to find out how this story ends. America's far, far less willing to take those kind of military losses in this post-Vietnam world, okay? You've also got the outbreak of war between Iran and Iraq in 1980, in which we, the Americans, are going to say, you know what, an enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine. And so we go ahead and we equip the Iraqi military with both military intelligence and financial aid, knowing that Iraq is ran by a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein, okay? We knew that he had used biological and chemical weapons on his own people, but we said, this is a good deal for us because he could help us take out one of our own enemies within the region. So all of this foreign policy mess, if you will, it gets dumped into the lap of the next president, George H.W. Bush, who we met the last time we had lecture. Bush had won the 1988 election in a landslide, and he really was a foreign policy expert. Before he was president, he was vice president, so there's valuable experience in there. He was the director of the CIA before that, so there's valuable foreign policy experience there. He was in the Senate, and he had served on countless numbers of foreign policy committees when he was in Congress, and so this really is an international relations foreign policy expert. And this is the guy that you want at the helm if you've got a crisis like what we've got going on in the Middle East. Now, speaking of crises, in 1990, our good friend Saddam Hussein decides that he's going to invade his oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait, and ultimately this captures the attention of the world. Because it's not just Kuwait that we're worried about, we being the Western world. We think that maybe he's getting ready to try to become the next Hitler in the sense that he's trying to take over country after country after country in the region of the Middle East. And so what George Bush does is he issues an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait, to go back to Iraq. Otherwise, he was going to Congress, getting a declaration of war, and he was going to kick him out of Kuwait. Now, ultimately, what Saddam Hussein does not comply. He does not leave willingly, and so what you see is the emergence of what we call Operation Desert Storm. What I want you to understand about Desert Storm is that this is the first Gulf War. This is the United States liberating Kuwait and pushing the Iraqi army back into Iraq. If you've ever seen popular films like Jarhead, you'll know that this is a relatively short war, and it's very, very decisive. The combination of airstrikes and sanctions, economic sanctions, nothing getting in, nothing getting out of Iraq, had a devastating consequence on the Iraqi military's ability to be able to wage the war. And so by the time that the ground troops actually go in, you know, the Iraqi military can't surrender quick enough. There's this euphoric celebration back in the United States. I mean, George Bush was an extremely popular president in the aftermath of Desert Storm. He himself said, you know what, we finally kicked that Vietnam syndrome. The war was short. It was clean. We had an international coalition of countries that supported us, and it was very decisive. But the other thing that we do not do is we don't occupy Iraq. You know, around about the time that there was a ceasefire, news outlets like CNN, which was a brand new news organization at the time, they began asking people like Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney, Dick Cheney, who would later go on to be vice president under George W. Bush, why did we not go all the way to Baghdad and take out Saddam? He was an evil man. He was a brutal dictator. Why not take him out when we had the opportunity? And it's Dick Cheney that said, well, we could do that. We could do that relatively easily, although, you know, it's not going to be all that cheap for those people that are going to lose loved ones in the process here, military casualties. But at the same time, we don't have an exit strategy. That ought to strike you as kind of ironic in the sense that it's going to be Cheney that will be a really big factor in the second Gulf War several decades later. But in any case, you don't have an occupation of Iraq, and we basically allow Saddam to lead Iraq for the foreseeable future. Now, just a second ago, I mentioned that George Bush was a very popular president at the end of this war. That popularity would wane incredibly quickly when, in 1991, early 1992, the economy began to crumble, okay? Part of this is the natural ebb and flow of you know, a capitalist society. There are good times which are followed by contracting times, and they're followed by good times. Well, the problem is a lot of those issues that we were creating in the early and mid-1980s, budget deficits and things of that sort, those problems finally came back to bite us in the early 1990s. Only this time, that social safety net that had been placed into effect as early as Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, that had really been eaten away at over the course of the Reagan and Bush years. There were fewer social programs, economic relief programs that were designed to catch people before they hit the bottom. And so what I'm talking about here is a pretty severe economic recession that is really not doing the Bush presidency any favors when it comes to his prospects of being reelected. Now, Bush has a decision to make. He can do nothing, which is essentially what Herbert Hoover did the last time something like this happened. Or he can go back on that campaign promise. Keep in mind, his mantra that campaign season was "read my lips, no new taxes." He can go back on that promise and raise taxes but save the American economy, which is ultimately what George H.W. Bush decided to do, which, in my opinion, he deserves quite a bit of credit for, because this was quite akin of political suicide. Keep in mind that when the economy is in the toilet, we tend to blame the president that's in the White House at the time. So he's already going to be, you know, taking a little bit of a hit when it comes to his poll numbers, his approval ratings, but his decision to raise taxes really isolated his base that helped get him elected in 1988. And so the people that were instrumental in his election victory in 88, they're either going to sit it out this time or maybe they're going to vote for somebody else in 1992. Now, speaking of that somebody else, in 1992 we see the emergence of Bill Clinton. And Clinton described himself as a different type of Democrat, a guy that could bring in some of these old coalitions that were so instrumental in the Democrat success in the middle decades of the 20th century. You may or may not know this. Bill Clinton, from a small town in Arkansas, Hope, Arkansas, from a very middle-class background. The reason that I'm telling you all of this is that when the economy tanked in 1992, not only did Bill Clinton have a pretty intriguing record as the former governor of the state of Arkansas, when it comes to how you deal with something like this, much like Franklin Roosevelt, but because his middle-class background was emphasized throughout the campaign season in 1992, when he would go in front of people and say, "I feel your pain," people believed him. He grew up in a middle-class household, and so he understood what it was like to have a parent laid off, or, to have to make these tough decisions. Now, I'm not saying that George Bush just didn't appreciate the severity of the crisis, but what I am saying is the Bush family, being what they are, this very wealthy, very well-to-do family, they didn't exactly scream middle-class sympathy. And so when people heard Bill Clinton say, and this is what his campaign slogan is going to be in 1992, "It's the economy, stupid," there's a lot of political punch that was associated with that. Okay? He's going to team up with a senator from Tennessee by the name of Al Gore, and together what they're going to put together is an all-Southern. He's from Arkansas, Gore's from Tennessee, and an all-baby boomer, people that were born in the 1940s in the aftermath of World War II, an all-Southern, all-baby boom ticket, campaigning on a pro-middle-class platform. Now, if you're looking at my slide that says the Clinton presidency, I want you to take a look at that bottom image. You can see Bill Clinton there. You can see George Bush. Looks like he's talking to somebody on the left side of that image. But then there's a guy right in the middle. The guy right in the middle is Texas billionaire, guy by the name of Ross Perot. Okay, I bet you've heard of him before. In '92, Ross Perot ran on an independent ticket, but for all intents and purposes, he was a conservative. He was a Republican. And so what that's going to do, anytime you've got two Republicans running against one Democrat, that's really going to favor the Democrat in the sense that the Republicans will split their vote. And if that's not bad enough, it was George Bush that Ross Perot would attack, not as much as Bill Clinton. George Bush would try to dismiss him in televised debates, saying, "Perot, you don't have any experience," and Perot would come back and say, "You're right, George, I don't have any experience in running up a $3 trillion debt. That was all you. I just don't know what you're talking about," right? So in any case, this is not good news for George Bush. And so Bill Clinton's going to win the election of 1992, if you're looking at an electoral map, in a very convincing fashion. On the surface level, it looks like a landslide. But when you dig deeper, you find out that Clinton only won 43% of the popular vote in 1992. Now, the fact of the matter was there were two Republican candidates, and the fact that they were splitting their votes, 43% is more than enough to carry you to victory. And so it's 43%, but it's also in states like Missouri, like Kentucky, states like Nevada, which were not exactly, Democratic strongholds. Those were very, very red states throughout all of the 1980s, and here they are going over for Bill Clinton. And so I think that what we can take away from 1992 is it ultimately was a referendum on the American economy. Had that election been held right after the Iraq War, you might not have ever heard of Bill Clinton before. So Clinton's going to win this election, and in the process, he's going to make some very significant and also, I might add, very powerful enemies that felt that he just was not qualified to be president. These enemies are going to mobilize their forces in a lot of ways and try to make Bill Clinton a one-term president, okay? Not exactly the results that they're going to be hoping for when we get to 1996, but when we get back, I'm going to be talking to you about the Clinton presidency and some of the things that the American people are going through at the time.